and welcome to Midweek, Experiments in Faithfulness. So this is a weekly facilitated spiritual practice with a Quaker flavor and an experimental ethos. My name is Jen Higgins Newman, and I'm the program manager here at Beacon Hill Friends House, where I live and work. The Friends House is a Quaker center for learning and action, as well as a residential community of about 20 people who live according to Quaker values based in downtown Boston, Massachusetts. And tonight, for some of you are regulars, some of you have never been to a midweek program or a Friends House program, so I'm going to give a little bit more explanation. We're doing things a little differently than the way we normally do them. I'll be co-facilitating this practice this evening with my dear friend, David Coletta, and our practice tonight is called Exploring Hybridity. So as the world changes quickly around us, it is unclear what the future of programming will look like exactly. What we do know is that we have learned a lot about the value of both in-person gatherings as we reflect on what we've missed, and online opportunities for things like accessibility and connecting across geographic areas. As we move into the future, creating connections and being together, how can we learn from this year and think creatively about engaging the future? So in this midweek practice this evening, we'll explore some possibilities around hybrid programming and invite you all to think expansively with us and to hold expectations lightly as we explore hybridity. So now I'm excited to introduce you to my friend David. As a teenager in the late 1970s, David came to Quakers through the New England yearning Young Friends program and volunteered as staff for another decade. Completing a first career in technology and yearning to focus on people rather than machines, David discovered that the pandemic created the ideal conditions for him to find that work. David's leading is to serve Quaker meetings and organizations by exploring faithful use of technology that supports worship and community. David is also a dad, the CTO of a cannabis startup, a podcaster, and one of the hosts of Three Rivers Worship Group. We're going to talk about framing our time together. So what do we mean by exploring hybridity? So we want to take a step back and look at this from a framework. So I'm going to talk about dualisms. And for folks who don't know what a dualism is, it means a division of something conceptually between two opposed or contrasted aspects, or the state of being so divided. So it means things like, God exists or God doesn't, and it must be one or the other of these things, for example. So there is a dualism that exists between what we consider the in-person and the online. And so in this pandemic, we've experienced this sort of online world. But in language, there's a dualism that exists between the fact that something exists as an online program and a thing that exists as an in-person event. And often people say things like, the in-person is better because it has these qualities to it, and the online is deficient in these ways because it doesn't measure up to what we had experienced in person. As we move in this pandemic to a new era of thinking, we need to think about things in terms of hybridity. This is our proposal to you. And what do we mean by this? So hybridity means the possibility of mixture. But I think it enables us to take a step into a new way of thinking that doesn't say, here is what the gatherings were in person, here's them contrasted to what they are now online, but to think about how we can create the experience we want to create and center the people and the experience and spirit, leveraging the spaces that we have, which includes in-person spaces like our meeting houses or our event spaces or the Friends House, and includes online spaces that each have their own quirks and definitions, but the purpose is not the space and what the space itself can inherently provide. The purpose is the people and the activities that you want to have together, whether that's experience in worship or that is experience in an event or learning something together. And our spaces provide different technologies, different modes of being. And so I'm going to turn it over to David to give a real explanation or a metaphor about what we mean by this.
Yeah, when Jen first mentioned this notion to me, the metaphor that popped into my head was of different rooms at Beacon Hill Friends House. If you've ever been to the Friends House, there's a big, beautiful parlor on the first floor with a lot of comfy chairs and a piano and a lot of spaciousness. And then down in the basement, right off of the meeting space, there's a small Quaker library, and it's a little bit cramped. If you walk into the house some evening for a committee meeting, you might end up going to the parlor. And in the parlor, you know, we can sort of be expansive and set all our stuff out on the table, and it's great. But other times we might find that the only space available was the meeting library, which is smaller. And we wouldn't say, oh, the parlor's the place to be and the meeting library is terrible. We'd sort of understand that because of circumstances maybe not entirely under control, we have one space at one time and another space at another time. And then we might even take the next step and notice that whereas in the library we have less room to move, there's all these great books, and they might actually inspire the content of the worship or the committee meeting that's happening in there. And so the invitation is to look at online or hybrid or in person with that same eye towards different spaces offer different things, but you know, to start saying one is the one we like and the other one is the one we eschew, well, that kind of causes problems. Jen will get to that in a second. And similarly, you know, I saw this tweet a couple of weeks ago by accident almost that said something along the lines of, you know, two things can be true at the same time. It can be true that Zoom is exhausting and we're all sick of it. And it can also be true that in Zoom, there are things we can do, and particularly with regard to accessibility, there are things that people of differing abilities can do that they can't do in physical spaces. And so, you know, we want to be careful when we talk about one thing being better, another thing being not so good, who we are leaving out. Better for whom?
Yeah, exactly. It made me ask that when David and I were prepping for this, made me ask the question sort of whose good is it that gets to define sort of this space is good, but this space isn't as good. Well, good according to whom? And I think we need to reframe it that way as we think about our spaces that we're creating for worship or for events, that it is, you know, who are we, how are we able to create community across platforms that enable people to have the benefits of Zoom that has really enabled our meeting communities, our other communities to expand to people who otherwise couldn't have accessed. It has just increased their expansion for them. The Zoom is great. And so how can we capture that and also capture the problems that, or the, not the problems inherently, but the things people miss about being in person? And how can we think across platforms to provide that? And it's going to take some experimentation and it's going to take some holding things lightly, but we need to think about sort of good according to whom as we make statements about what works and what doesn't work for our communities.
We have this program called Menti that we're using.
So we're going to onboard you right now. There's some guiding principles for our time together, for what that's worth while folks are getting onboarded. We invite you to stay curious. We invite you to embrace experimentation, to move with discomfort, and to notice and name values and feelings. So if you notice, oof, this isn't working for me, I'm having trouble, you're like, oh, I noticed that. This is hard for me. What do you think of when you hear or read the words hybrid worship or hybrid event? Folks can continue answering. We're going to move to defining what we mean by hybridity for you.
We're interested in finding the biggest, most expansive, most inclusive way of thinking about this word hybrid, not just this kind of more narrow idea of like Zoom plus in person, but really the idea that um, the faithful use of technology as part of worship involves pulling from all the resources that are available, all the people that are available, all the technologies that are appropriate. And if you think about hybrid in the most expansive sense, you can look back at the history of technology and friends grappling with it. Imagine what it was like for friends who discovered that they could distribute printed materials using a printing press. And what kind of questions did that raise? What was it like around the turn of the 20th century when telephones started to become, in greater use? Could you have a committee meeting over the phone? Could you have worship over the phone? Like, friends have been grappling with these changes in technology for a long time. What's really, I think, unique about this time is the way in which we were thrust into it so quickly. Steve Mulkey, the general secretary of New York Yearly Meeting, says he thinks, this pushed us ahead 10 years in like one day. Of course, it didn't push everybody ahead equally, which also reminds me of that idea that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet.
When David and I were talking, I thought, so what is the heart of hybridity for us? So for us, the big heart of it all is thinking about how we can continue to deepen our connections to each other and create a wider and more inclusive circle. So we want to invite you to think about what the heart of it all is for you. So we have 2 questions on Menti. The first is going to be about what are some of the things you're worried about? What are some of the challenges that you're facing? And the second is going to be to turn toward the positive. What are some of the hopes that you have? What are some of the positive values you have as you think about what the future of worship or hybrid events or other ways of being together are? So folks should be able to see that on the screen now. I'm going to pull this up and you can just answer and everyone will start to see the screens. Folks should still be able to access the previous question. I want to turn us toward the next one. What are some of the positive values or hopes that you hold around the future of events? And we will share these slides with you and all of the information we gathered in addition to the recording after the fact. And this one's fun. It's a word cloud. So the words get bigger the more people put the same word. So if you see a giant word, friends are in unity about that, or we're getting close to that. Give it another moment here, and then we're going to move to an activity for you. This is a facilitated practice, but it's not just David and I talking at you this evening. We're going to now invite you to engage with each other and with us. So we're going to move into a group activity. So I'm going to explain how we're going to do the activity, and then David's going to delve a little deeper. So we're going to give you all a scenario. And this is going to be sort of in our experience of working with meeting communities or in our own communities, something pretty real, but not yours. So you can just kind of examine it. You can take the balcony 30,000-foot view of this scenario. This is not yours to hold, but it is a thing to think through. We're going to offer you a few moments of reflection on the scenario and what you might do. And then we're going to put you in some breakout groups, and we're going to pay attention while you're doing reflection to how many folks are in your space. If you would like to just be in a breakout room with the person that you're in the screen with, in this case with my housemates, I'll be in a breakout room with them. We will make that happen for you. And you're going to work through the scenario together. And then we're going to invite you to pick a group person who's going to submit a little Menti short description of what your group decided around this scenario. And then we'll have some time for group discussion. And then we'll have some time, hopefully, for you to ask questions of David and I.
The group of you in the breakout room are your meeting's reopening committee. And you're aware that your charge is to figure out where you want to land in this place where you're having worship in your main meeting space every Sunday, where some people are in person and some people are remote, coming in over Zoom. But you want to walk before you can run. You don't want to try to jump all the way there at once. So your charge for tonight's committee meeting is, what are the first couple of experiments you try? What are the parameters of those experiments? How do you do it? And there's an invitation here to separate all the COVID safety stuff out for a different time and just focus on the faithful use of technology. And this conversation you're having is also a conversation about care of worship. What are the things that you do leading up to the experiment to set expectations? What do you do during the worship to help people? And after the experiment, how do you accompany people who've had some experience there that they might need to process? And there's one more thing to think about. In your community, you've talked to people, there's different kinds of energy. There's energy for experimentation and learning, and people will want to make lots of mistakes as fast as they can so they can figure out what works and what doesn't. And then there's other people who have a deep concern for care and thoughtfulness and keeping worship calm and predictable. And they want to go slowly and thoughtfully. And both forms of energy are important. They're both needed at the same time, even though they may seem a little bit contradictory. So your charge is also to hold these two threads and minister to everyone who brings either kind of energy without leaving either group behind. Is this complicated enough yet? Good luck.